sin, who knew no sin, that we might become his righteousness. He humbled himself and carried the cross. Love so amazing, love so amazing. Jesus Messiah, name above all names, blessed Redeemer, Emmanuel, the rescue for sinners, the ransom from heaven, Jesus Messiah, the Lord of all. His body the bread, his blood the wine, broken and poured out all for love. And the whole earth trembled, and the veil was torn. Love so amazing, love so amazing. Jesus Messiah, name above all names, blessed Redeemer, Emmanuel, the rescue for sinners, the ransom from heaven, Jesus Messiah, the Lord of all. And all our hope is in you. And all our hope is in you. And all the glory to you, God, the light of the world. And all our hope is in you. And all our hope is in you. And all the glory to you, God, the light of the world. Jesus Messiah, name above all names, blessed Redeemer, Emmanuel, the rescue for sinners, the ransom from heaven, Jesus Messiah, the Lord of all. Jesus Messiah, the Lord of all. Welcome, everybody, to this Wednesday night service during Holy Week. We're so glad that you're here, that you've joined us, and we're just delighted to be able to enter into this traditionally, this night of the Passover, and to celebrate that, to celebrate the sacrifice that Jesus gave for us. And to help us with that tonight, we're so glad to have Alison Hawanchak, who's here just to offer a great word. Alison?
Thanks, Scott. So great to be here with you guys tonight. I want to start with reading some scripture for us. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and grab them, turn them on, however you need to do that. We're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 11. So it says, "Once you have entered the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you take possession of it and are settled there, take some of the early produce of the fertile ground that you have harvested from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and put it in a basket. Then go to the location the Lord your God selects for his name to reside. Go to the priest who is in office at the time and say to him, I am declaring right now before the Lord my God that I have indeed arrived in the land the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. The priest will then take the basket from you and place it before the Lord your God's altar. Then you should solemnly state before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt, living as an immigrant there with few family members. But that is where he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. The Egyptians treated us terribly, oppressing us and forcing hard labor on us. So we cried out for help to the Lord, our ancestors' God. The Lord heard our call. God saw our misery, our trouble, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with awesome power and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land full of milk and honey. Now I am bringing the early produce of the fertile ground that you, Lord, have given to me. Set the produce before the Lord your God, bowing down before the Lord your God. Then celebrate all the good things that the Lord your God has done for you and for your family." All right, so that's our passage for tonight, so it's our focal point. And some of you might be wondering, why would I choose Deuteronomy in the middle of Holy Week on the night of Passover? Why would I choose Deuteronomy when I can talk about Jesus' last week on earth, or even talk about the first Passover that happened in Exodus? Well, we're going to find out. So let's start with a little bit of context to kind of help frame where we are in the biblical story. The book of Deuteronomy is when the people of Israel have just finished their 40-year journey through the wilderness, and they have made it to the edge of the promised land. Finally, they have reached the place that God has promised to bring them to for all those years. However, right before they enter into the promised land, Moses decides to preach a sermon. And not just any sermon. This sermon is a 33-chapter long sermon. So I don't know about you, but if I had just finished a 40-year-long excursion through the wilderness, the last thing I would want to do is sit and listen to a sermon. I would want to go home and kick my feet up and relax and know that the journey is over. Y'all feel me there? But Moses knew that this was a significant moment for the people of Israel. So it required a moment of theological reflection, a moment to remember where they came from, how they got here, and how life is going to be different on the other side. So this particular section here that I just read to you is directing the people to how they should live once they get settled in the land. After they've had their first harvest, they are to bring their first fruits to the tabernacle and present them to God. They are also supposed to say this liturgical response that we just read. He says, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt, living as an immigrant there with few family members. But that is where he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. The Egyptians treated us terribly, oppressing us and forcing hard labor on us. So we cried out to the Lord for help. And the Lord heard our call. He saw our misery, our trouble, our oppression, and brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and outstretched arm, with awesome power and with signs and wonders. So here, as they recite this response, they're offering praise to the Lord, and they're recalling everything that has just happened to them. This little call and response here that they say when they bring their first fruits demonstrates for us how the Exodus event, or Passover night, is embedded into the very life of the people. Often when we think about Passover, we think about that final plague that happened when they were in Egypt. How the Israelites were told to paint the blood on their door frame and not to leave their house that night, while the angel of death took the firstborn from each house that was not covered with blood. This is definitely a major piece of Passover. It's the first place that it gets instilled as a ceremony. But Passover celebrates more than just that final plague. It celebrates the entire Exodus event, how God delivered them out from Egypt, brought them into the wilderness, made a covenant with them, brought them into new life, and then led them to the promised land. All these things, which in the Bible story takes us from Exodus all the way through the book of Deuteronomy, are part of the Exodus event, and they're all celebrated in Passover. So tonight, I just want to focus on one piece of the Exodus, that is the covenant. The covenant made between God and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai is at the core of the Passover, and it's the foundation of Israel's identity and their relationship with God. The covenant relationship between God and the Israelites is predicated upon his mighty acts of deliverance, which he performed with them while they were still captive in Egypt. As we heard them say in that liturgy, they say when they bring their first fruits, God brought them out with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Before entering into the covenant with them in Exodus, God reminded them of these acts. So we read in Exodus 19, verses 4 through 6, right before the covenant is enacted, God says to them, "You saw what I did to the Egyptians, how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to me. So now, if you faithfully obey me and stay true to my covenant, you will be my most precious possession out of all the peoples. Since the whole earth belongs to me, you will be a kingdom of priests for me and a holy nation." So while they were still trapped in the hopeless situation of bondage and oppression in Egypt, the people cried out for God to save them. And he showed up in a mighty way, not only to end their bondage, but to lead them out of that life and into a new life of freedom with God. Although before they could enter into that new life, they had to agree to the covenant. God offers them a relationship, but it is their choice to be a part of it. So as we see in verse 9, right after God recounts this to them and offers them the covenant, they say, all the people responded with one voice, "Everything that the Lord has said, we will do." So right there, they accept that relationship, and the covenant begins between God and his people. Now I want to make a little side note here about the relationship between the covenant and the law in the Old Testament. So if we're looking at Exodus here, where they start the covenant, they were in chapter 19, the law section doesn't begin until chapter 20, after the covenant has already been enacted. So the law here was never intended to bring salvation for the people. Only God does that. God brought salvation to his people when he led them out from Egypt with his mighty hand and outstretched arm. That was the saving moment. The law came afterwards to define the nature of the relationship between God and the people. The law demonstrates for the people how they're supposed to behave now that they have entered into a relationship with God. The law is what sets them apart as God's people, his precious possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. All right, now back to the covenant. That was just my side note for you all. Back to the covenant. When the people cried out to God from their slavery in Egypt, they didn't expect the answer God gave them. They were most likely expecting God to lighten their load, probably overthrow their oppressors, but what they got was much more than that. God brought a great display of power in those 10 plagues, demonstrating that he is more powerful than Pharaoh, and he is more powerful than the gods of the Egyptians. So after this display of power, God divided the sea and led his people into freedom. And then by the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, he led them through the wilderness all the way to the promised land. So the celebration of Passover reflects upon this abundant answer of God. So during the actual celebration of Passover, the leader of the family guides the people at one point in the evening through a call and response. It's quite lengthy, but I want to read you a few lines of it, though. The whole call and response opens with a question. It says, "For how many good deeds are we obligated to the omnipresent?" And then they answer it with just these few lines here. They say, "If he had taken us from Egypt, but not punished them, it would have been sufficient. If he had punished them, but not destroyed their gods, it would have been sufficient. If he had provided for our needs in the desert for 40 years, but had not fed us manna, it would have been sufficient. If he brought us before Mount Sinai, but had not given us the Torah, it would have been sufficient. And if he had brought us to the land of Israel, but did not build the temple, it would have been sufficient." This call and response here demonstrates two things for us. One, it shows that the Passover celebrates the entire Exodus event, and the covenant relationship between God and its people. Note it references the Torah, it references the temple, these two things that kind of stand at the core of the relationship between God and his people throughout the Old Testament. The second thing it points out to us is that it shows that our God is one who provides in abundance. They would have been satisfied if God had just delivered them. If he had just freed them, they said that would have been sufficient. But God was not satisfied with sufficient. He wanted to give above and beyond the expectations of his people. They are his treasured possession. We are his treasured possession. So he gives them everything they need and then some. So coming back to our passage for the night, Deuteronomy 26 here, we see that when the people gather their first harvest, they offer it to God and recite the story of Exodus as the foundation of their relationship. Now, one thing I want to point out is the interesting way that they tell the story here. They tell the story in first person. They start off by saying, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, and he sojourned there, and he became many. But then they say, the Egyptians treated us harshly. They oppressed us. They put hard labor on us. So we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our cry and saw our misery and brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Now, the book of Deuteronomy here takes place at the end of the wilderness wanderings, right before they go into the promised land. But if we remember, they were in the wilderness for 40 years, and the whole point of being there was so that the generation who was in the wilderness was not going to see the promised land. So these people here that are getting ready to enter in Deuteronomy, they didn't live in Egypt. They were born in the wilderness. So they actually weren't there during the Exodus event. But they celebrate it and they recite it and they talk about it as if they had been there. It's such an integral piece of their story that it shapes their lives, and they live it even though they weren't actually there to witness it themselves. And the same thing is still true today. In modern Passover celebrations, Jewish people celebrate and retell the story as if they personally had came out of Egypt, even though they personally didn't. They still celebrate it that way. The Exodus event for them is not something from the distant past. It's part of their own personal history with God. It marks the beginning of their relationship with him and shapes the rest of their own life story. Now, the same thing is true for us as well. The Exodus from Egypt is part of our story as well. It's part of the beginning here. That's why it's still part in our Bible. It's the very beginning of the story. The God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, he's the same God who answers our prayers. The same God who gave them all this abundance that they didn't ask for, but he knew they needed. He's the same God that provides an abundance for us as well. However, for us, this is just the beginning, because we as Christians celebrate the second Exodus, the one that took place at the cross. So it was no coincidence at all that Jesus' death took place at the same time as Passover. At the Last Supper, we see Jesus and his disciples celebrating the Exodus and the covenant that God made with his people. All the while, Jesus knew that the greater salvation and covenant were just about to be enacted. In the first Exodus, God saw his people enslaved in Egypt, and he acted to save them from their bondage. At the cross, God saw his people enslaved to the desires of sin and death, and he acted to save them from their bondage. The salvation in the first Exodus was a physical kind. At the cross, we're offered a spiritual kind. In the Exodus, God saved his people with a great display of power through all the plagues that he sent on the Egyptians. At the cross, God saved his people with a great display of power by humbly embracing death with outstretched arms, only to conquer it 3 days later. After saving his people in the Exodus, God invites them into relationship with him through the covenant. And the same is true at the cross. Through the salvation offered by Jesus, we are offered relationship with God in the new covenant. Now, I could talk all night for you about the symbolism and the connection between the old covenant and the new covenant, but we'll save that for another time. For now, I just want to point out that both of these things, both the Exodus and the cross, the covenant stands at the center. God saves his people from bondage for the sake of the covenant. He doesn't save them so they can go about their way and do whatever they please. He saves them so that he could be in relationship with them, so that he can call them his own. In the Exodus, we get the image of God looking upon his people who are trapped in Egypt. And he stands up and he points to those people and says, those are my people. I want to free them. Here's the payment. I'm bringing them into freedom. They're mine. However, his people failed to uphold their end of the relationship time and time and time again. But our God is faithful despite our unfaithfulness. So at the cross, we get a similar image. God looks down on the world and sees them trapped in bondage to sin and death. And he stands up and points to the world and said, those are my people. They are mine. I'm going to pay for their freedom. Here's the payment, my son. I'm going to bring them back to me. However, this is just not for the people on earth at the time. God at the cross does this for all people in all times. God claimed the world as his own, and in that, he claims us as his own. He has paid the redemption price and made a way to lead us with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm from slavery to darkness into freedom in the light. And he invites us into relationship with him, because that was his goal all along, to bring relationship to his people. So reflecting on our Easter situation this year, I know that many people feel disappointment since Easter kind of looks a little different than what we're used to. But the power of Easter still stands. As I reflect upon this time of social distancing, it makes me think about there's this threefold process that social scientists say underlie transition periods in our lives and important moments when we go through change. And they say that these transition times have three periods. There's a time of separation, there's a time of transition, and then there's a time of reincorporation into the new way of life or the new stage or whatever's on the other side of that transition here. So going back to our passage tonight from Deuteronomy, we see this threefold process in the life of the Israelites. As God protected them from the final few plagues in Exodus, he sets them apart from the Egyptians, separates them from their life of slavery, the life they were living in. He brings them into the wilderness, and as they're journeying through the wilderness, they undergo a transition from a group of slaves to a group of God's own people, his treasured possession. In this time of transition here in the wilderness, God teaches them what it looks like to be in covenant with him. Finally, we reach the book of Deuteronomy at the edge of the promised land, and they're ready for reincorporation, to be reincorporated into this new life in the promised land that God gave to them. So this middle part, this threefold process, this middle part of transition is also sometimes referred to a liminal period. These liminal times are confusing because they're the time between. You're not here, you're not there, you're just kind of stuck in the middle. And the nature of these periods is hard to define because they're transition times. You're just stuck and you don't really feel like you're going anywhere. To me, this time of social distancing kind of feels like a liminal period. Many of our day-to-day routines are suspended, and we kind of live in this middle time that's neither here nor there. We're just kind of stuck in the middle. But the good news is that these liminal times, they do come to an end, and we do reach the point of reincorporation into something new. So for the Israelites, it was reincorporation into life with God and his free people, rather than incorporation into their old life. So these times of separation, transition, and reincorporation often occur at pivotal moments in our lifespan as we experience changes. We have been brought to this time of separation, kind of against our will. We're just brought here into this separation time, this transition time. So my question for you with that is, what pivotal moment in your spiritual life journey is God bringing you to? What is God leading you to do in this time of separation and transition? What transition is he calling you to make? How will your spiritual life be different when you reach the time of reincorporation? What are we going to be incorporated into? Maybe God is calling you to recommit to that covenant relationship that you've had with him. Maybe he's calling you to commit to one for the first time. Maybe he's calling you to pick up a new spiritual practice that you haven't had before. Maybe your prayer life, your Bible study, something like that. Or maybe there's a practice he's calling you to abandon in this time. a practice that distracts you from God, and he's calling you to lay that aside. As we prepare these next few days for Easter, I hope that you'll spend some time in prayer, and you'll ask God, what are you calling me to? Where are you leading me to in this time of transition? What is that new life that he's trying to incorporate you into? So that way, when we reach there, we know where we're going. Above all else, though, I hope that this time of Easter is a time that we can reflect upon how God has delivered us from a life of bondage and has offered us new life in his covenant of grace. So that just like the Jewish people who celebrate the first Exodus as the beginning of their own personal story, we too can celebrate the second Exodus as the beginning of our own personal stories. Because each of our stories begins there at the cross. In spirit, we were there on the hill the day he died. And we were there 3 days later at the empty tomb. And that was the day we were all redeemed. That was the day we were offered salvation and offered new life with God. The covenant just lays open now for us to accept that relationship and live into that new life. So I hope we keep that in mind as we celebrate this Easter moment and reflect upon how that is the foundation of our story. Amen.
Ooh, how could it be that my God would welcome me into this mystery? Say, take this bread, take this wine, now the simple made divine for any to receive. By your mercy we come to your table. By your grace you are making us faithful. And we remember to worship, and as we worship you, our worship leads to communion. We respond to your invitation. We remember you. Body, his blood, know that he has overcome every trial we will face, and none too lost to be saved, none too broken or ashamed, all are welcome in this place. By your mercy we come to table. By your grace you are making us faithful. Lord, we remember you, and remembrance leads us to worship. We're so glad y'all have joined us for this time of worship tonight. And we just want to make sure that you join us again. I want to make sure you know that we're going to be worshiping together on Friday night at 6:30 live for our Good Friday service. Derek Warnick's going to be preaching that night, and it's just going to be a beautiful time for us to reflect on the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And then we're so much looking forward to Easter Sunday. It'll be a different Easter for us, of course, but we've got great plans for worship and to be in the presence of